Good afternoon. I'm Tom Clark. I'm the editor of Prospect magazine, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this seminar in conjunction with the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law and supported by the Jones Day Foundation. What cements this three-way partnership between Jones Day, Bingham and Prospect is a shared interest in and commitment to the rule of law. And it's been going from strength to strength. Previous discussions have featured former Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Sumption and his one-time boss, Court President Lady Hale. Those seminars explored the border zone between law and democracy and the importance of the rule of law for London as a centre of international dispute resolution. Today, we're thinking globally again about the rule of law and most acutely human rights when they run up against something that should concern us all, the supply chains that we rely on as shoppers and consumers. How do we achieve a legal level playing field that can secure protection for those at every link along that chain? We have, as in our previous discussions, not only an esteemed panel, but also an esteemed audience, including many lawyers and officials who I'm sure will have sharp questions to ask. Can I ask you, though, to make sure that you put those in the Q&A box on Zoom, which we're all very experienced with now, rather than in the separate chat function, as it's a Q&A that the team are going to be keeping a look out for. I'm delighted now to be handing over to Harriet Terrett of Jones Day, who will introduce our other splendid guests. But by way of introducing Harriet herself, her day job is advising companies on disputes, compliance and regulations, including, pertinently to today's discussion, international obligations such as sanctions. She's a founding member of Jones Day's Blockchain and FinTech initiative and a regular participant in its anti-human trafficking projects, all of which involve doing what we're doing today and convening thinkers and practitioners with the single aim of developing rule of law based solutions to global problems. In other words, I couldn't leave you in safer hands. So over to you, Harriet.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Just let me add my thanks to Prospect magazine, the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and to each of you for joining us in this third of a series of debates addressing key rule of law issues that affect our everyday lives. As someone who has both a personal and a professional interest in our topic for discussion today, I wanted to give a brief introduction, but particularly to add my thanks to our panellists for agreeing to speak with each other this afternoon. Our title for discussion today is Managing Global Supply Chains in a Post-COVID World, Current Challenge or Future Opportunity. Well, if you've ever heard the saying, go big or go home, today we're taking probably two of the biggest issues facing policymakers and business leaders. Recovery from a pandemic on the one hand, against a commitment to environmental, social and governance standards on the other. And we're going to be asking, is there a balance that can be struck, or even if those two priorities are actually inconsistent? In terms of format, we have some outline questions that our panelists are going to discuss, but frankly, everyone is very open to seeing where this discussion takes us. We're hoping to make it as interactive as possible. Audience members, just to refresh what Tom said, please do add your comments or ask your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Please do it as we go through, don't save it to the end. We've got quite a lot of ground to cover. And if you have a question that's pertinent to the discussion, I'll definitely try and elevate it. Please do keep it respectful. Please do keep it on topic. Any questions that I put to the panel from the Q&A will be unattributed. And just looking at the number of people we have on, which is fantastic, I apologise in advance if we don't get to address every single point. We're joined today by two people who are leading this discussion in their respective fields of policy and business, the Baroness Lola Young of Hornsey and Nick Bayton, CEO of ASOS. Baroness Young had a successful early career as an actress and presenter. She went on to become Professor of Cultural Studies at Middlesex University and then Head of Culture at the Greater London Authority, before being honoured by the Queen for her work advocating for the recognition and preservation of Black British history. She was then appointed as an independent crossbench member of the House of Lords in 2004 and her parliamentary work includes founding and co-chairing 2 all-party parliamentary groups, one on ethics and sustainability in fashion, one on sport, modern slavery and human rights, so both right on point. She's been a member of several other select committees, and she currently serves on the House of Lords COVID-19 committee. So very much ticking all of the boxes that we want to talk about today. I will also say she was an instrumental member of the group which developed and supported the groundbreaking UK Modern Slavery Act 2015 through the parliamentary process at the time. Nick Bayton is the driving force behind one of the UK's most successful fashion brands, ASOS. He's a chartered accountant by background. He's held senior roles at a number of major fashion brands before joining ASOS as Chief Financial Officer in 2009, Chief Operating Officer in 2014, becoming CEO in 2015. During his tenure, ASOS has grown both in the UK and around the world. It's one of the world's leading online fashion destinations. It's known for its focus on innovation and increasingly for its focus on sustainability. Nick is a member of the Retail Sector Council, a trustee of the ASOS Foundation, and he most recently hit the headlines when he called for the implementation of mandatory human rights diligence, due diligence laws for companies in an effort to boost the 2015 Modern Slavery Act. Lola, Nick, thank you for agreeing to join us today. The two of you know each other, you've spoken on these issues together over a number of years, but I think this is the first time you've come together in a post-COVID environment. I think it's fair to say from our preparation, there's a lot you agree on, but also some points that you perhaps differ on that I'm sure will come out. But I would like to start with a big picture question, and perhaps a slightly personal one. Why is this such a critical topic for the two of you? And maybe Lola, if I can start with you, of all of the issues in front of you when you joined the House of Lords, why this one, and why is it still such a focus for you all these years later?
Well, thank you, Harriet, and thanks to everybody for convening us this afternoon. As you say, Nick and I have worked together in various ways, but we'll see what comes out in terms of differences as we go along. Actually, your question is interesting because this wasn't on my plate, as it were, when I first joined the House of Lords in 2004, which is like a millennia ago. It wasn't until 2009 when it was revealed to me that in this country we had no legislation, no criminal legislation outlawing forced labour or domestic servitude. And working with a whole fleet of people, NGOs and other peers, we brought in an amendment to the Coroners and Justice Bill, which introduced this criminalisation. And that was my first encounter with thinking about contemporary forms of slavery, although it weren't called that in those days. In 2009, people weren't talking in more public discourse around modern slavery. So that was a bit of a sort of revelatory moment. And then I think as I got to what I was interested in from the get-go was at fashion. And I was kind of aware of the environmental sustainability aspects of that, but not so aware of what was happening in supply chains, which again wasn't a term of common currency until 2013, when Rana Plaza hit the headlines, and that tragedy, I think, was a lot of people's introduction to some of the awful things that were happening in the fashion industry, particularly in supply chains. I'd already co-formed the all-party parliamentary group on ethics and sustainability in fashion. And so we really got down to this whole business of supply chains. And then subsequently, when the 2015 Modern Slavery Act came in, or was going through Parliament, a number of fashion companies were kind of lobbying, actually, alongside other companies, saying we really need this transparency in supply chain section in the Modern Slavery Act. Because I think at first the government, which was then a coalition government, were a bit reluctant to implement that. So people fought and fought, and we got it through, albeit with flaws. Then we had a review a couple of years ago, and maybe we'll get to talk about some of that later. But to me, the central issue is it's an instance of social injustice in which all kinds of different forms of unfairness, inequality, discrimination come together. And that's something that I've been interested in since I was really quite young. So in a way, it was a kind of natural fit, and being able to use the platform of the House of Lords to, as it were, spread the word around this has been very important for me.
I mean, I find it interesting that kind of you're talking about the journey, but also how still you feel there's quite a lot to do, and I'm sure we're going to come back to that. Nick, effectively for you, the same question to get us going. You've worked in the fashion industry for, you know, at least 15 years. What is it that's driving you, both in terms of your sort of, you know, your advocacy for the industry, but also to speak up as in the way that you have been, really, particularly over the last sort of year or so?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know ASOS, ASOS will be about a 4 billion turnover organisation this year. It was founded in the UK 21 years ago. I can tell you my journey was very different to the journey Lola just described. I worked in finance and planning roles for most of my time in fashion. It was around the time that I moved from being a CFO to a chief operating officer. I actually asked a couple of questions and said, look, how do we make our clothes then? And before that, all I'd done was, done planning, thought I was driving the growth, but I didn't actually understand how we made clothes. And I certainly didn't understand who made clothes. So I went on a couple of sourcing trips, went on a couple of factory visits, Leicester, Turkey, Mauritius. I then sat and listened, and I saw some things that I didn't like. And I went, is that what happens? And they went, yeah. And I'm like, surely we can do better. And they went, well, we can, Nick, but this is not the way it's been done in the industry. And it took me some time to get into gear with that one. And I was suffering from I've seen something, I've heard something, I just don't like it. So I then collided with another thought going, you know, when you're lucky enough to be in a position of influence, which I am, which I never thought I would be, and then you see something and hear something that you don't like, you better well use that influence. And so that was how those things collided with me. And I sat and thought about it. I spoke with our people and I went, we aren't going to make our clothes that way. Well, we aren't going to allow humans to work anywhere in our supply chain, wherever our shadow of our brand falls, and have them in a position where they have no choice, they have no option. So it's a very human thing for me. When I sat and looked at it, I couldn't get it out of my brain. And then I went, that's not going to be my gift to our customers. That's not going to be the gift to the people who work around the world for us. So we can do better. We must do better. So I don't consider myself an activist or anything like that. I just came at it from a human perspective going, I'm in a position of influence. I don't want to be asked the question in many years' time, when you were in that position of influence, Nick, and you were aware of this issue, what did you do? So that's what drove me to take a different stance on this and take leadership on it, or try to take leadership on it, with a view that if we take leadership with it, others might follow. And so that kind of got us to where we've got to and the things you've outlined today, Harriet.
Great. I mean, firstly, thank you for sharing, because I think it's really helpful just to understand where you're both coming at this sort of from. And I think the personal definitely informs the professional. So I really relate to that. One thing that you both absolutely agree on is that there is a role for government to legislate for businesses to take responsibility to prevent exploitation in their value chains. Now, in the UK, we have the Modern Slavery Act. I suspect most people who've dialed in here know what that's about, but it effectively requires larger organisations to set out publicly the steps that they have taken to eliminate modern slavery, or that they have taken no such steps. That's still an option within our current legislation. You know, groundbreaking at the time. I think it's fair to say other countries and regions are now going further, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that. But maybe just another big picture question. What do you think is working well about the Modern Slavery Act currently, and the practical, maybe just the practice of making supply chain statements generally? And what are the areas that need improvement? Nick, as someone who's just gone through this process with the ASOS statement just having come out, maybe if I can start with you, what do you think's been good about it? What would you like to see change?
So the introduction of the modern slavery statement in 2015 collided with me having the thought processes I've just described. And we sat and thought about it. And we didn't just read what the transparency statement was asking us to do. We tried to put ourselves into the minds of the people who had drafted it. And then we were going, look, this is what they're trying to achieve. Now, even though there is things in there that are not far enough in my view, which I spoke about a couple of weeks ago, we went, they're looking for transparency. They're looking for better. They're looking for companies to actually use the power of their purchase order to do good things, not bad things. The gift of trade is extremely important, but actually the gift of trade done well is even more powerful. So we tried to sit in the shoes of the legislators. We tried to sit in the shoes of the recipients of what we would do. And then we tried to reimagine how we'd go about doing it. And so when we put ourselves in that mind frame, in that mindset, and we asked ourselves those questions, it became natural. Go, this is about transparency. This is about doing things better. This is about shining a spotlight on areas that you don't normally shine a spotlight on. This is about standing in the shoes of vulnerable people. And this is about asking yourselves how you do better. So that was how we approached it. Now, I think it should be tightened. I think it should be tightened to drive people to do the things we did, because not everyone will. And I've always seen the role of a waterfall effect here, where legislators, governments should actually drive and draft legislation to create that thought process and then follow it up again to ensure it's on everyone's agenda. And that's transparency, that's accountability. Make me as a CEO accountable. Make me have to have a conversation with people who I'm accountable to. Make shareholders ask me the question. Don't wait for customers to ask that question. Do business better. Create that conversation so it creates the thought process to actually go, you're right, we've got to fix something. If you do that, you get a natural flywheel. So that was how we approached it. And that collision of that legislation was extremely timely on our journey.
I mean, if I was sort of going to summarize, the fact of the statement is the good, but you would sort of advocate for, significantly more obligations on businesses to be accountable. I don't want to kind of put words in your mouth, but for people who haven't read, for example, what you wrote in the Times a month ago, can you maybe just sort of expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So we decided to do it and do it properly. So it was not just listing the name. It wasn't just saying we have a modern slavery policy, which you can technically do. We went, actually, we're going to use transparency. We're going to lift the lid. We're going to lift the lid and show you where our garments are made. We're going to try and show you who they're made by. We're going to try, I was then advocating that actually discipline processes behind had to be mandatory, and actually you didn't have to just say, I've got a statement and publish a set of words. I was actually asking for substance behind the statement rather than just a set of words that you can technically comply with. That's what I was calling for. We went a step further. We invited, to create substance behind it, we've worked with many unions around the world. And that's not a natural habitat for business and unions to collide. But it was basically formed out of this. We went, we can't be in every place at any time. So if we encourage freedom of association, we can create many eyeballs to help us solve this problem. So that's where we find an alliance. So we signed an industrial global framework agreement with Industrial. That was really important. And so this is where partnerships can help you achieve the same thing rather than rubbing against each other. So that was really important. We then went, okay, where else do we have to get a partnership to help push us? And a partnership pushes as well as pulls. And so we turned to Anti-Slavery International and went, right, why don't you critique everything we've done? And why don't you act as that critical friend and tell us where we can go further, go faster, go better? And so we then published our recent slavery statement, modern slavery statement, and we actually asked Anti-Slavery International to critique it, and we published their comments within our statement. And it was during that process, we then got to a place going, we've got to get this more consistently applied. We've got to get more substance behind it. We've got to call for something different. So that was the process and how we got to it that led to the modern slavery statement and call to create more substance behind the statement.
Right. I mean, Lola, you sort of heard what Nick has to say. I mean, effectively the sort of same question. If I was to ask you to mark your homework for the Modern Slavery Act, what do you think has worked well? What's had impact? And you, I think, had already mentioned you'd like to see some extension. Are you in the same place as Nick? Are you in a different place? Kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm in a very similar place to Nick, and in fact, I was, gratified to hear him make the argument for mandatory human rights due diligence. Nobody is saying that that will be the cure-all or the, the magic bullet that will save everybody and improve everything globally, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. And in terms of what's happening around the world, of course, the EU have by a large majority have elected to put in place that legislation. So any company doing business within the EU will have to comply with that anyway at some point. But as to the MSA, I mean, a lot of people surprised me, to be honest, from the business world by saying this is really great. We really want to do this. It's a game changer. We're so pleased. And that, of course, came from the reputable end of the business sector. Those companies that really valued their reputation and the fact that they're trusted by their customers and sort of took that responsibility seriously. So for those, that group of businesses, at least initially, it felt like something that was really not quite revolutionary, but certainly a game changer, as somebody said, as a number of people said. And Nick's already alluded to the possibilities that it opened up, particularly working with NGOs. And I have to declare my interest as a patron of Anti-Slavery International. And in fact, I think when it was through Anti-Slavery International that I first went to ASOS to a day that they held for the companies on their online platform, where we talked about the Modern Slavery Act. That seems like decades and decades ago. But the interesting thing was, I think around that time, there was so much ignorance around this, and like people saying, oh, I don't even know who's in my supply chain, as if that was something, if not exactly to celebrate, not anything to be ashamed of. And I think we have moved on from there. The Act has enabled, as I've already said, and Nick said, NGOs to engage with business, also other activists and journalists to investigate what's going on, trade unions to have a say. It's kind of opened up a whole range of actors to enter into this space and actually make some changes. And I think it's also in an interesting way opened up a different kind of dialogue with consumers / citizens, which is about, who knew what a supply chain was before. And post Rana Plaza, fashion revolution started up, and that was a really significant moment too, as they started to ask people to ask who made my clothes, because only very sort of small number of activists and those in the know would ask those questions beforehand. So I think the Modern Slavery Act helped to raise the profile, as it were, of all of those issues. But, and there's a big but, which again I'm sure we'll come back to, but it isn't strong enough. The government's revisions go some way to addressing that weakness, but I would also say that without effective monitoring and implementation, doesn't mean anything, because we still have a large proportion of businesses who've never reported. And given that you can get away with saying, well, we have zero tolerance to modern slavery and sign that off, that is your kind of bare minimum. Given that people can do that, and there's still some companies that haven't completed their modern slavery statement. So we'll see. I don't know if what the government intends to bring in later in this year will have an impact on those companies that feel they're pretty safe from any kind of real scrutiny.
Perfect. I mean, I will just sort of mention the Q&A. We're starting to see some questions coming through, but do please use that as we're going through. Otherwise, you're really going to be a conversation between the three of us. And we absolutely want it to be a conversation between, the 200 people odd who are listening in. I think last big picture question, we can't ignore the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's created unprecedented challenges for businesses, really, frankly, across most sectors. Even lockdown-friendly businesses have struggled to remain profitable, and businesses of all sizes across the world are facing challenges, whether it's rent arrears or lack of customers or government-backed loan repayments. At the same time, the pandemic has, at least in my view, frankly highlighted the existing inequalities that existed within the global economy. You only look at, for example, the rush for PPE and the allegations of governments, I have to say allegations including the UK, sourcing protective equipment without regard to the conditions in which it was produced. Now, Lola, you're here as an independent crossbench member. You absolutely do not speak for the government. But when you look at the record of the UK in the context of the pandemic and supply chains, is there a bit of sort of do as I say, not do as I do, or at least a feeling that principles run second to practicalities in a crisis like the one we've just experienced?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And of course, I know that there'll be people who have every sympathy with the government that is forced into a position whereby it needs to produce a certain amount of PPE, medical equipment, and all kinds of other things in this very, very difficult and challenging sort of moment. But in a way, you can say that that is kind of the ultimate test of what your resolve is and how much you really are signed up to these principles. Because to me, you don't suspend human rights principles because you're facing a really difficult and challenging situation. Now, you're absolutely right when you said that, you felt, Harriet, that what COVID-19 had done was to highlight inequalities. Actually, I think many of us on the COVID-19 committee, the select committee, think that it's actually exacerbated the inequalities. So we knew that those inequalities existed in some kind of vague sort of way, or some of us more specifically, but this has really thrown a light on it, as you say, but also emphasized those inequalities, in fact, widening the gap between the haves and have-nots, whether that's in terms of wealth or whether that's in terms of power and influence. Incidentally, I read something the other day that said more billionaires are being created during COVID-19 than at any other period. How does that even work? So we recognize that this had this impact in the UK, and of course it has globally too. I was reading, I had some figures from the Clothing Manufacturers Association of India, where 72% of the Indian garment industry's micro, small and medium enterprises have received less than 25% of their payments that have been due during the pandemic, and that 50% of orders have been cancelled. And the impact of that isn't just on those individual companies, it has an extensive ripple effect. So people become then more prone to being exploited by traffickers and people engaging in criminal activity through modern slavery. Those people who have lost their jobs, where do they go? They go back to the small villages from whence they came, but maybe taking disease with them, maybe taking COVID-19 with them and spreading that and making that an issue. And once you get back to those small areas, then there aren't the facilities to help people with oxygen and other medical assistance. So it's an appalling set of consequences of COVID-19. It's not true to say that you could say that the disease doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate itself, but certainly its impact is discriminatory. So I think it's incumbent upon brands here and elsewhere in the global north to think about what their responsibilities are. Because I don't think you can maintain a relationship which is purely built on extracting wealth, extracting resources, extracting the labor of people from elsewhere, from over there, from overseas, and not exclusively, but an awful lot mainly in the global south. You can't just sort of say, oh, well, okay, we're having a really tough time now, so we're just going to kind of haul up the drawbridge and look after ourselves, and we're going to cancel our orders, etc., etc. So the devastating impact. And through the all-party parliamentary group on ethics and sustainability in fashion, we've had quite a lot of personal testimony from factory owners and managers in Bangladesh and in India testifying to this, and just asking that the orders be honoured, or that some form of compensation is available. So yes, it's had a huge impact here. I'm not trying to underplay that, but if you think that we act globally when we feel like it, and then all of a sudden when you need solidarity and support, we kind of close in on ourselves and say, well, we've got to look after ourselves first and only. So I don't think that position is acceptable.
And Nick, sort of, I mean, any reaction to what Lola has said? I mean, I'm conscious, you know, even as a business that has seen as one that's been successful and thrived under lockdown, you'll have had to make some hard business decisions. How do you square that with the quite personal and passionate sort of defense you make of what you're doing in your supply chain?
Well, I'll give you an example of 12 months ago. First of all, the pandemic has been brutal for all of us, right? But it's even more brutal for people at the end of the supply chain, or the beginning of the supply chain, I should say, because those are the things you don't think about and see. It's easy going, Nick's an online business would have done well. Actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. 40% of our product is for event driven, going out, going to the theatre, going for dinner with your friends, you know, going, and it's all about that, going on holiday, going to a festival. Well, guess what? There was none of that for the last 12 months, right? And so we had to face some very, very hard challenges. 12 months ago, we did our cash stress tests, and our CFO said to me, well, I don't know what it's going to end up like, but if it continues like this, we'll run out of money. And so we immediately had the following principles. We started with principles, right? How do we keep our people safe? Right? How do we give ourselves, our customers, the confidence that we're keeping our people safe? How do we think about the suppliers, of which there are 170,000 individuals around the planet depend on our trade? How do we keep them safe? And how do we make sure they're there the other side? Because if we get through the other side, and those people that we rely on to create our garments for us aren't there, we lose. So we went through that order. We had to break it down into chunks. So we went, right, we've got to keep the organization safe, so to keep our people safe. So we raised significant amounts of money on the stock exchange. We didn't take any government support because we went, actually, we should take our own, we got shareholders, supporters, that's what we should do first. We then went, right, how do we give our customers the confidence that we're doing the right thing? So we explained what we were doing. Right, then the tough one was, guys, you just cancelled a load of orders. We've cancelled a load of orders because actually there was nobody wanted any dresses for most of last year, regrettably, and we're really good at dresses, and so and we sell a lot of them normally, and then we had to do a trade-off between our values and our principles and financials, and at this point I was worrying about it. At this point I had a nudge from one of our NGO partners, who was actually Anti-Slavery International, going, "Oi Nick, how are you going to do this?" And I actually went, "You're right." So I had that nudge from a partnership at the right time. So we then made sure we paid for cancelled orders, part made, and where they'd committed labour and fabric. And that took me a few weeks to square that circle. It was because I was balancing trading off, doing the right thing, trying to keep the organisation safe, people in front of me, and then people I couldn't see elsewhere. So we then went, "You're right, we've got to do it." So we raised the extra funding, kept the organisation safe. It would have been easy not to do anything else, but we did. And then we went, right, we need to set up a support mechanism. So we carved out, for our suppliers, we carved out some funding, and we went, we're going to keep placing orders with you. We're going to change the product mix. We're going to pay you all the way through. We're going to accelerate our payment terms, and we're going to check in with you every week to make sure you're in good shape. And if you're not in good shape, we had some emergency funds that we put to one side to assist. So that's how that's a real story of how we handled it. I guess the point here is if you truly believe in principles and doing business better, you can't trade it off when the business bites. You have to do both hand in hand. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. It just means they're hard decisions, but isn't everything we do.
And no, firstly, thank you for that, because I think it's interesting. The Q&A has just suddenly lit up, because I think people can see you both kind of engaging on not just the easy issues, but the difficult issues. I would like to come back, Nick, if you don't mind, to that question of balance. So the question's been asked, how do you balance transparency with self-criticism, but particularly, and this has to be from a lawyer, managing your litigation risk? So, you know, at what point do you worry that something you say then becomes effectively a millstone around your neck in 5 years' time, either if it turns out not to be true or if the world moves on? I mean, kind of what is your risk assessment process? That's part one. And then I would like to come back to your shareholder supporters, because I'm really interested how you engage with presumably some very big institutional shareholders who are looking to get value from their investment pension funds, because they're funding all of our pensions. How do they see it as well?
Right, those are complicated, Harriet, and good questions. I'll do an easy one first of all. Being a big business that ASOS is, I'm also very lucky to have a very well balanced legal panel and internal general counsel who actually advises and is completely entwined in both values, and we can't do that one, Nick. And that's been tested recently with the Uyghur region and some thought processes we had on all of that. So I'll leave that one for now. I will start with, if you're going to take a position of leadership on something, it requires being brave. And bravery always has people who want to criticize, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. So and bravery requires sticking your head above the parapet every now and then and going, no, this is how we're going to do it better. And there's always haters, and haters only want to hate. So you can let them. So that doesn't bother me. And so there are many people who have said to me before, well, won't that increase the costs? And I'm like, I can find a way of doing this better, but actually it's the right thing to do. So, and then, so that's how we deal with it. And there's always trade-offs that we have internally in risk mitigation. On the shareholder point, I'm a big believer that legislators will shine a spotlight on areas where business hasn't gone and should go. Capital markets then pick up the thread, and then capital markets then start to shape boards, which start to shape CEO behaviours. But occasionally there's outliers where boards and CEOs break away and are brave enough to do so. But that's the usual cascade. One of my shareholders during the fundraise and actually said, what are you going to do with this? And so I'm going to back you. Are you going to do the right thing? And we went, yes, this is how we think and behave. And he went through specifically, are you going to do this for staff? Are you going to do this for your suppliers? Are you going to do this for your people? And are you going to contribute to Nick? And so he asked me whether I would participate in the fundraise, and he asked me whether I would take a pay cut because some of our people were on an ASOS furlough, not a government furlough, which mirrored the government furlough. And he said, if you say yes to all of those, Nick, I'm in. And that was a very good conversation. I would like to suggest that I'd like to wish that those conversations happened more. They don't always happen more. Sometimes the conversation is, what's your growth rate next year? What's your profits going to be? But that was a very, very strong conversation I had with 2 or 3 shareholders actually at that moment. And we went, you're absolutely right. This is what we're going to do. And we followed through on all of those things we discussed together. And that's a positive shareholder interaction. And that's the way governance should work.
Great. Lola, again, I'm just going to try and keep it in the Q&A. One of the things that a couple of people are asking about is Nick's call for what's called a sort of failure to prevent type of offence. So effectively making companies liable for failing to prevent exploitation in their supply chains, similar to the approach that we have under the Bribery Act or the facilitation of tax evasion. I mean, as someone who's very involved in the legislative process, what do you think about that as a sort of concept? Is it one you're comfortable with? Do you think there are intermediate steps? You know, the sort of questions being asked, what's the political appetite for going that far in terms of strengthening rights, do you think, in your view of what's going on in both of our houses?
Well, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry.
Is that
sorry.
gin?
It's the long COVID hangover bit.
Okay.
So yeah, my throat goes every now and then. So no, well, I think the interesting thing for me is always the number of and the quality of businesses who are demanding more. You know, in fact, I would say there are a number of businesses who are way ahead of government of whatever political stripe in this country, wanting to push. And the reason, as explained to me, is quite simple, and I'm sure Nick will agree with this. It's that thing of the level playing field. Why should those companies who are prepared to do the wrong thing as opposed to the right thing, why should those companies make profit out of human misery, and because they're willing not to care about that, and to undercut more scrupulous businesses? And that's a really big issue that's come up time and time again. My own view is that whatever laws we have, they've got to be properly implemented. And as I said before, monitoring and implementation is absolutely key. And I think there should be penalties. One of the things we asked for in the review of the Modern Slavery Act a couple of years ago, and in the transparency in supply chains, was that we kind of look at that bribery model, the Bribery Act model, and say that somebody on the board has to be responsible for looking at supply chains and ensuring they're not engaging in these kinds of exploitative and abusive labour. So I think it's quite clear we've got a long way to go before I can feel that we've gone too far, as it were. And I think some of the legislation that you talked about internationally took at the basis of what we've done and built on that. And I think that's absolutely right. Most notably, from my own point of view, with regard to public sector procurement, where Australia put that straight away into their Modern Slavery Act. We've only just had the acknowledgement now from government that public procurement, which is a huge, huge amount of money and could have a really big influence, that will happen hopefully later this year. Just to pick up on something, so Nick was talking about shareholders, and I think that's a really interesting development that I've seen, which is that some of them at least see that they can be part of the solution to these set of problems, and that kind of sensibility that actually we only want to invest in companies that are prepared to do the right thing, and we can help and support them in doing that. And I think the more of that, of course, the better. I was very struck as well a few years ago when I was still relatively new in this space, at a conference of people working in the construction industry, which is also very high risk, just like fashion, in terms of modern slavery. And somebody said, from a relatively conservative organization, small c conservative organization, if you've got a business model that doesn't allow you to deliver the right thing, then you've got to change your business model, haven't you? Because how can you just stand there or sit there and say, well, it's okay, actually, you know what, our business model doesn't allow us to look after people. Most people would want to distance themselves from any kind of thought that they were pursuing a similar agenda to the transatlantic slave trade, right? So if you bring in those set of arguments about, oh, well, we can't change our business practice because it would mean we would lose money. What are we talking about? Historically, we look back over that 300 years of history and say that was utterly wrong. And people are now catching up with, the way the various other political issues around that. But, quite simply, I don't think it's good enough simply to say, well, we can't do this because we won't be able to deliver enough profit to our shareholders. Yeah,
I mean, that's a great point. That this is just a glass wall that just doesn't really exist. It just means you haven't reimagined it. It's not real. It's one of those things that you just need to scratch and go, well, how can we do it? There isn't a trade-off. And it's one of these things between businesses where solutions to this should be open sourced. It's not a source of competitive advantage. So it's one of those where you open source your approaches, you collaborate to get to a better place.
I agree. And if I could, sorry, just because I was at a meeting earlier this week where we were talking about the role of micro and small enterprises in the fashion industry, because as you will know, Nick, that's what most of the industry comprises. And there are innovations and ideas and creative movements happening within that sector that could actually, you should talk about partnership and collaboration. Why not? Why not have those conversations with those kinds of bodies and see what can be scaled up, or whether you actually want to scale down and change the whole way you operate. So I think the more that people can have that open and transparent approach, the more likely we are to find these solutions more quickly.
100%.
Yeah, so much I want to unpack from that, but I've got one really specific question. You talked about monitoring for the refuseniks, basically, the people who aren't like Nick, who are out there, who are being transparent. What does that look like to you, that kind of proactive monitoring with penalties that result? Are we talking about setting up a body? Is it international? How does it work?
So
sorry, go on, Nick.
You go first, Lola.
You go first. You go first, then I can just agree with you.
It starts with values, right? And it starts with values, and then substance behind those values. And then I'm talking about my own supply chain first of all, and I can go higher if necessary. And then you go, well, how am I going to implement those values? So when I say yes to something, I know I've got a process and something with substance to support that. And when I make a statement, there's something authentic and real about it. So we developed several techniques where you can't rely on audits. Audits are part of the detection. They're not really the prevention. It's a moment in time. So we developed a technique with a series of logic checks, and logic checks so you could get a sense of seeing what was happening in a factory over many period of time, using data to solve it. And simple one going, right, I know you've got 50 employees. I know the minimum wage should be this. Tell me about any bonuses this year. Yeah, it's this. Right, then I know what your capacity is, your throughput is. This is what your payroll bill should be. Show me. And if your payroll bill doesn't work on that logic check, well, then you're either paying them the wrong wage, you've got subcontracting labour going on, and that's also a red flag. So please show me. And so those are the techniques that help detect and close the door and shape behaviour. And then you've got to be clear enough to have actually a risk profile, a risk register, where there's real teeth behind it. And you've got to be very careful how you apply that. And so and be prepared to have a tough conversation. And it's going, right, you have now got X period of time to remediate the people that are in distress or vulnerable. You've got to clean up your act, or this purchase order is going somewhere else. And if you're prepared to follow it through, you only need to follow it through a couple of times, and then it shapes behavior. And so that's where monitoring and action all align. But you can't sit there and go, I've got an auditor that visits every 6 months and think that that's detecting what an issue. It will help you, but it's not foolproof. It's like the third line of defense rather than the first line of defense. And then we have 1,000 buyers. So we make many hands make light work. They interact with suppliers all the time. So we train them of what to look for, what to spot. So many more eyeballs. And that's where the unions come in. We encourage freedom of association, and each individual manufacturing unit, regardless of size, has an employee forum. So I can tell you, you walk straight to the employee forum and you can hear the management tell you what's happening. You speak to the employee forum, they tell you exactly what's happening.
And Lola, the external monitoring, I'm really interested in that. What does that look like to you?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I was thinking as Nick was talking, it's from an entirely different perspective. If I think of myself and us as consumers, as citizens, what do we want? I don't want to trawl through all this information. I want to know that I can go into a shop or shop online and that I can trust the company from which I'm buying. And maybe at some point, I don't know, there are different forms of certification, and maybe that is a help. They're not always a help, I have to say. Some of the proposals that I've seen aren't that helpful, but there may be a way there of kite marking particular standards and so on, because particularly a harassed consumer, you know, Saturday morning, school starts again on Monday, I've got to get all the kids dressed, etc., etc. You're not going to want to have to trawl through all of this material. So it's a good way to restore trust, I think, to have something that feels like it is doing that job. And then the other part of the labour, as it were, is for activists, NGOs to dig deep into that material and say, well, hold on a minute, you've said you're doing all of this, but actually what we've heard from the workers that we've been in contact with is something else. And so I think for those people to try and keep companies true. And then there's the criminal justice system, which is another part of that jigsaw. If you look at the Section 54, it's not like you can put people in prison for not having done a modern slavery statement, but you could, in theory, the Home Secretary can issue an injunction. And I don't think that a single injunction has been issued since that act came to pass in 2015, 6 years ago. So what's happening? You can act with impunity, as I was saying earlier, a number of companies have done. So the whole thing about transparency, it depends on where you're sitting as to what your kind of role in looking at it, scrutinizing it, trusting it, implementing it is. And the other thing I guess I would refer to is there are calls now, and I'd be interested to know how Nick and you, Harriet, as well, feel about this, the call for the equivalent of the Groceries Code adjudicator. So an independent adjudicator that would be established to curb abusive purchasing practices within the industry, within the garment industry. That's a proposal that I think the government are looking at, and a number of people have put some weight behind that. So that is another way of looking at and scrutinising the transparency issue.
Do you want to answer, Harriet, or shall I have a go?
No, you go first, and then I think people are more interested in what you've got to say, but I'll come back at the end.
So I think that all this needs strengthening, and I was less keen on an independent adjudicator. I was more keen on reaching to the trade bodies and strengthening their franchise rather than putting a new one in. And so the likes of the British Retail Consortium, and go, right, this has got to be a key aspect of it, and giving them some power to sit within that and strengthen them as well. So the principle, I agree. The how, I had a slightly different view. But I also think we could definitely borrow some of the principles in food that they've applied already. So the equivalent of the fair trade mark, what would that look like? Fair trade manufacturing. And I think that should be something that people, once that became a thing and it was empowered by the trade body with the strength to apply and police, it might give it a greater flywheel. But if that doesn't work, if I was a legislator, I would go to that too.
I mean, I think the point you make, Lola, about not actually enforcing the injunction power is really interesting. To Nick's point, you'd probably only have to do it a few times before people would get the message. And I think it's interesting that isn't a power that's at least perceived to be effective enough for anyone to go through that process. I mean, the question, I work exclusively in regulated industries. The question between self-regulation or independent regulation is across every sector, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think the important thing is that whatever you do has to have meaning. It can't just become another process that people manage and go through. It has to actually sort of have, you know, either some teeth behind it or actually something that people want to engage with in a positive way rather than seeing it as an obstacle effectively. And I think I'm quite neutral as to which it is, but I think boards need certainty as to the standards that they have to reach up to. And then they can set, as Nick says, their values again and their standards around that. But it's the certainty that I think is quite important. I have so much more that I want to raise. We've got comparatively few minutes left. I do want to come back to you, Nick, with consumers, because you said that this was kind of a values piece, and then you don't want to wait for the consumers. But I'm conscious we've really talked about nothing but challenges. I want to make sure we focus on opportunities. We've heard a lot about Build Back Better. Actually, both of you are really quite positive. What is it that is giving you hope that we are at a point of real change? I mean, you both mentioned you think there's this kind of inflection point and we're having conversations we wouldn't have done 10 years ago. What is it that's giving you hope that this is really going to change things going forward?
So issues blow through society and end up that we have to deal with. And so the last 12 months of the pandemic has surfaced an awful lot of that, right? It's been a pressure cooker for it. And I think consumers will emerge from the pandemic, and we're still in it, and we're not all out of it until we're all out of it. And so some of us are in a better shape than others in terms of territories and all of that. But I think consumers might go to a point going, oh, crikey, we are all connected. We are all humans. We all share the same wants, needs, values at the end of the day. And the thing we've just been through as a society has actually been indiscriminate of everything. And so they may emerge going, I've really thought about something in a different way. Something that emerged in Wuhan, China, that then actually stopped the world for 12 months is bound to create a reflection. It's bound to create a change. It's bound to create a moment where people re-examine. We won't all go back to where we are. It's not a pause, reset. It's a step change in thinking. So these are things that we gather and we should harness and make changes in that moment. Because I actually think consumers will turn around and start to ask businesses what they're doing to do these things, what they're doing to keep people safe, what their policy is on people, what their policy is on gender balance, what their policy is on improving diversity, and actually what that policy is and substance about improving the lives of people in the entire supply chain. So I'm absolutely where that is. And so I think that is a real moment to change. So, and I think that's the why. But one thing consumers won't do, they won't pay more for you to do those things, because in the consumer's eyes, companies that make lots of profit, they'll go, you should do that. And actually, if you don't do that, we'll think about where we put our hard-earned money and whether we go somewhere else. So that will be the thing that boards, businesses need to get their head around.
Lola, radical thoughts from Nick. I mean, great opportunity for change. What's giving you hope at the moment in this discussion?
Well, lots of things give me hope, and in a funny sort of way, history gives me hope. When I think that it's only just about 100 years since women in this country had the vote. It's only, it took 300 years to get rid of the slave trade on British ships. Just that kind of narrow thing in legislation. So these things take time, but at the same time, that's not an excuse to sort of stand still and sort of think, oh, well, it'll all come out in the wash, because it doesn't. It comes out because people make these things happen. And I think it's often a kind of implicit, or not implicit isn't quite the right word, but it's not an explicit coalition, but things happen. And, you know, something happens over there. If you think what happened with George Floyd's murder last summer, and the consequences of that, whatever some people might like to think about Black Lives Matter, there's no doubt that it made a lot of organisations, a lot of companies absolutely have thoughts that they'd not had before. And I think, you know, if you think back 30, 40 years ago, when people who advocated equal opportunities were completely laughed out of court, and, you know, they were mad, they were loony left, they were this and that. Equal opportunities is so mainstream, it's old hat. So it's like these things do change. And one of the things that really energizes me is seeing, well, in the old days, seeing that sea of faces out there saying, look, we really want things to change. What can we do to help make these things change? What kinds of pressure can we put on? And I had a discussion last night about fashion futures. And there was one kind of this thing that often comes up, oh, you're only preaching to the converted, right? So, you know, you get people into a room and or on Zoom and they all agree with you. And my response is always the same. You know, that's not the issue. The issue is, how do you help and support those people who want to make changes and help them to feel that they're not alone, that they have a big job of work to do. And if we can have those conversations together, we can all go out to those different places and say, hey, look, this is what we've been talking about. And as a consequence, these are the changes that we need to make. So you help to give people the strength to go out and do these things, because sometimes it can feel very lonely, particularly if you're at the beginning of one of these kinds of movements, so trying to gain that momentum for a particular set of issues. So it's not a question of feeling optimistic or pessimistic for me. It's about the realism is that things will change. So what is it that we, each of us, can do as individuals to make that change and to make the right changes? And that's the key issue.
We're almost up at our time. I'm going to finish with just one quick fire question, if you don't mind. Lola, if there was one thing you wanted Nick to do in his business over the next year, based on the discussion today, what would it be?
That's unfair. You've let Lola go first.
You'll get your own
I think
back,
that's absolutely fair. And I think it's also fair that I'm going to smuggle two asks in, because I did think about one. There's a philosophical question and a more practical question. I guess the practical question is, you know, what is it that we can do or that you can do to ensure that all garment workers across the global supply chain are paid on time, receive fair wages, there's no cost cutting or corner cutting around health and safety, and that since, as we said about the pandemic, what about the non-payment by UK brands? Now, I know you're not responsible, Nick, single-handedly for all of those, but what can you do to make sure that your own house is fully in order, and also to proselytize to, as it were, to other companies? And my other ask, just very quickly, is a philosophical question. And you kind of touched on it, interestingly, which is how you connect all these different things: the poverty, the inequality, the discrimination, the racism, the environmental sustainability, the modern slavery. They're all interconnected. How do we address that? How do we get to know that whole picture, but still not feel totally overwhelmed by it and disempowered?
Wow.
And Nick, I'm
That's
not
all.
expecting you to answer that question now, because if nothing else, this would be a great subject for a second series.
I agree.
But having heard that, what would you ask Lola in return? If you wanted her to go back to the House of Lords when it opens up and advocate, or at least understand something from your perspective, what would it be?
So I don't have to answer that really tough question.
No, not yet.
I'm going to go 2 points though. It is all the same, Lola. Gender, diversity, Black Lives Matter, supply chain vulnerability. It's all people, right? And it's all humanity. You know, when we commoditize the word serve in retail, but serve isn't just giving you something on time. It's actually serving the purpose of humans. And we sell fashion, but actually what we really do is we're serving their need and their purpose and their well-being. And actually nobody will want to buy clothes from me if they think there's been shortcuts along the way and humans have not been served in that process. So it's a responsibility for all business to actually think about that, what we serve and how we serve and what service means, because it's a human requirement. So I think it's all connected, and it's not a different channel of anything. It is all connected. And so that's my simple response to that. And the other bit is, one day we'll be great at this, Lola. Until that day, we'll just keep getting better. So that's all we can do.
So effectively support the businesses that are out there trying to make the change,
right,
like yours.
Influence, create fast followership, be brave enough to call out something we don't like.
I'm just going to say, someone in the chat has just said literally education, 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 which I think is a really great note to leave on. Education consumers, you know, educating your suppliers, but actually kind of just all taking a little bit of personal responsibility, which is frankly the thing that I think I will take out of this today.
Through transparency.
Education and transparency. Nick, Lola, we're at our hour. I just wanted to say thank you both. Well, first of all, for coming on.
You're not going to let me have the question answer now, Harriet.
Oh, well, go for it then. Go on.
If you had a magic wand, Lola, what would you do when you go back to the House of Lords in a few weeks' time?
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Nick. Sorry.
If you had the magic wand, what would you do with that magic wand when you return to the Lords in a few weeks' time?
Well, there's some things I do that I better not say in public, but I would speed up the legislation around modern slavery, I would get those debates on mandatory human rights due diligence and the adjudicator, just so that we had a sense of what the pros and cons of each of those steps might be, and ensure that anything we do does have a very strong element of monitoring, implementation, and penalties for people who don't, for companies who don't comply.
Yeah, that works. You need to bust into the agenda, so it's on my agenda and every business agenda somehow. And I think that stick and carrot through the tightening of the legislation is probably the best way to do it right now, because otherwise it won't.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, yeah. Sorry, no, go on.
It won't shine the light in the dark corners until people do or are forced to. So.
I think the other thing, sorry, I know we've got to go, but you know, we talk about sort of raising the standard, raising the bar, raising the ceiling, as it were, to what we can achieve. But I think we also need to raise the floor, because at the moment it's too low and there's too big a gap between those companies who don't give a stuff and those who really are trying to do something very interesting and important. Yeah,
agreed. I think it must be time, Harriet, because my wife's just given me the hurry up as she walked in.
No, absolutely. Look, I want to say firstly, thank you both for coming on. I mean, I'm sure you get asked to a lot of these. It's a lot to come on and speak as transparently and openly and frankly personally as you both have, so I really appreciate that. Thank you on behalf of the many people who are on. Thank you to people who ask questions, to Baroness Lola Young and to Nick Baton. Thank you very much, and look forward to catching up with the next instalment maybe in a year's time.
Great, thank you everyone.
And thank you very much, because you're a great questioner, great interviewer.
Very good.
Good to see you both. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you soon. Bye.